Hi, everyone. For my neuroethical dilemma, I was specifically interested in the intersection between mental health and conviction. Guilty or non-guilty, responsible or not responsible, and defining the elements of a crime committed from a healthy individual, pay close attention to the intent, the act, and the consequences of the action. Only after consideration of these criteria can a committee or an individual reach a verdict of guilty versus non-guilty in the sentence. In practice, things may not be as simple, especially when we introduce the mental health of the convicted. The neuroethical dilemma, how should someone with a mental illness be addressed in the criminal justice system, raises a few questions. First, is someone mentally ill responsible for their actions, or is there some internal neurological condition that bears the weight of the action committed? Two, should a person's mental health affect the type of sentence they receive? And three, are prisons the most appropriate place for people who are mentally ill? If not, what is the alternative? And a general question is, what should the purpose of prisons be? So for my neuroethical dilemma, I aim to gain insight into the general public's answers to these questions through four different scenarios of varying mental illness severity and crimes committed by those individuals. After each dilemma, I ask the participants to answer how much they agree with the following statements based on a 5-point Likert scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree. So the first one being blank is responsible for their actions. Second one, blank deserves to go to jail. And the third one, blank should undergo rehabilitation. So let's get into the scenarios. So for the first one, Danny is a 21-year-old college student who often experiences small blackouts that result in temporary loss of consciousness. His doctor told him that he's at a higher risk of experiencing a syncope where there isn't enough blood flow to the brain. One day, after walking home, he briefly fainted. After regaining consciousness, he walked to a 7-Eleven and grabbed a soda and a snack, thinking his blood sugar was low, but walked out without paying. At the time, the clerk was in the bathroom, but notices the parking lot and calls the cops. After being detained, the officer discovers that he had stolen the food because he thought his store owner was the father, who owns 7-Eleven and oftentimes lets him grab a snack. Danny was a bit confused following his loss of consciousness. So for our second scenario, Mira is a 42-year-old female veteran who served in the military and was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder after witnessing a bomb explosion during her service. Her PTSD often results in having severe anxiety and intense flashbacks where she sometimes acts aggressively. Whilst watching the news, she sees that her daughter's school had recently had a bomb threat, and the children are currently evacuating the premise. Coincidentally, the social worker who does a routine checkup on her comes in after she heard the news. At this point, Mira is stressed and anxious, and the bomb threat prompts a traumatic flashback. In the rush of emotions, she attacks the social worker but quickly apologizes afterward. The injury isn't serious, however, there's some minor bruising and swelling. So for scenario three, Mark is a 26-year-old whose mother died with bipolar disorder a year ago. Following her death, he soon begins to experience major shifts in his mood that affects his sleep, energy, thinking, and behavior. After seeing a doctor, he is diagnosed with bipolar disorder and was at a higher risk because his mother had it. Struggling to pay some bills and college loans, Mark begins to be desperate for money. He tries to ask around for help, but everyone is either unable or unavailable. Feeling stressed and concerned about making ends meet, he begins to experience a manic episode and as a result feels extremely elevated and invincible. In the heat of the moment, Mark decides to mug a stranger in a desperate attempt for some cash. He threatens the stranger for a gun drawn and successfully gets their phone and wallet. The stranger is not physically harmed. For a final scenario, Emily is a healthy 32-year-old woman who recently found out she's going to have a baby. She and her husband John were trying very hard to have a child and were beyond excited once they heard the news. A year later, she begins to experience severe depression after having her baby, which is something she didn't expect. Additionally, she is struggling to form a secure bond with her baby that is constantly crying and distressed. As this goes on for 5 months, she begins having trouble falling asleep, becomes more irritable, and occasionally tells her husband, I can't do this anymore. The following day, while her husband is off at work, she smothers her child to get them to stop crying and eventually kills her baby. So to recap, here are four individuals. Danny, 21-year-old student, experienced a syncope and stole a soda and a snack. Mira, a 42-year-old veteran, diagnosed with PTSD and attacked a social worker. Mark, a 26-year-old college graduate, he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, mugged a stranger, but there was no physical harm. And for Emily, a 32-year-old mother, diagnosed with depression and killed her 5-month-old infant. So whenever we look at who's responsible for the actions, 55% of participants either strongly disagreed or disagreed that Danny was responsible for his action. And for Mira, 48.4 either strongly disagreed or disagreed that she was responsible. So there's similar degrees of consensus, but more participants believe that Mira is more responsible for her actions. However, whenever we look at Mark and Emily, about 3/4 of participants either strongly agreed or agreed that they're responsible for their actions. So whenever we look to see who's going to jail, all the participants either strongly disagreed or disagreed that Danny and Mira should not go to jail. So both of these scenarios, these individuals are not guilty. However, whenever we look at Mark and Emily, there's a higher degree in diverse answers. So 22.6% of participants believe that Mark should go to jail. They agree with the statement, whereas 48.4 strongly agree or agree that she should go to jail. So while Mark is perceived to be more guilty than Danny and Mira, Emily is perceived to be the most deserving to go to jail. That said, though, this response is not unanimous, and we're only about 50% that are agreeing. So before getting into like who should undergo rehabilitation, I wanted to introduce the perception of prison from the participants. When prompted what the primary function should be, 77% of participants responded that rehabilitation should be the primary function. 4 male participants responded that punishment should be the primary function, and 1 male responded with deterrence. Additionally, 1 female participant included in her response that prison should be to protect the public from people who are a danger to others. So getting into rehabilitation, 50% of participants either strongly disagreed or disagreed that Danny should undergo rehabilitation. So again, very diverse set of consensus here. For Mira, about 87% either strongly agreed or agreed that she should undergo rehabilitation. So not a large consensus for Danny, but most of the participants believe Mira should go. And whenever we look at both Mark and Emily, everyone either strongly agreed or agreed that that they should undergo rehabilitation. Mark was like needing to undergo rehabilitation more so than Danny and Mira, as per the participants, and Emily was perceived to be the needing rehabilitation the most, but 74.2% strongly agree. So looking at our overall results from most to least, as far as who's most responsible, Emily is perceived to be the most responsible. Then we go to Mark, Mira, and Danny is the least responsible. As far as who's most deserving to go to jail, both participants answered both Emily and Mark. And the reason we didn't include Mira and Danny is because both of these were unanimously decided that they should not go to jail. As far as rehabilitation, Emily and Mark were the most deserving to go to rehabilitation with the unanimous consensus, with Mira and Danny being the least needing to go to rehabilitation. So looking at our discussion, the bulk of the participants were from ages 18 to 24, so there wasn't a lot of variance between there. As far as the gender composition, 19 were female, 11 were male, and 1 was non-binary. So we were interested in see how gender participants contributed towards this degree of consensus. So we asked them this question in the demographics. Should identities, for example, age, gender, etc., be considered when deciding the sentences of criminal offense? Male participants were split at 50-50 for yes and no. 12 out of 19 females believe that these factors should be considered. So while there's a little bit of an effect of gender here, we're uncertain to see if this will lead to harsher or more lenient sentences. So while there are only instances of consensus for Mira and Danny not going to jail and Mark and Emily needing rehabilitation, I wanted to see how the previous demographic question might affect participants' responses. For this, I looked at how male and female participants answered in instances of low consensus. So in regard to convictions, 7 out of 19 females believed Emily should go to jail, whereas 7 out of 11 males believe that she should. For 5 out of 11 males believe Mark should go to jail, whereas 2 out of 19 females believe Mark should go. So for this, male participants were more likely to say someone should go to prison than female participants for either sex. But in regards to rehabilitation, 3 out of 11 male participants believe that Danny should undergo therapy, whereas 2 out of 19 female participants believe that he should undergo therapy. 11 out of 11 male participants believe Mira should undergo therapy, whereas 15 out of 19 female participants believe she should. So in this instance, it's unclear if gender has an effect on whether or not someone should undergo rehabilitation. But the results from the study do raise a few questions for future surveying and studies. The first one is rehabilitation being perceived as a type of punishment? So we're looking at some of the responses of the participants for this one. So for female 1, she strongly agreed that Emily should go to jail and rehab. But I believe primary function of prison should be rehabilitation. So this individual might perceive rehabilitation to be a punishment. However, for female 2, she strongly disagreed that Emily should go to jail, but strongly agreed that she should go to rehab. So for this and believe the primary function of prison should be punishment. So they might not perceive rehabilitation to be a punishment. And the second one is, do people with mental illness, do people want those with mental illness to receive help, but are unsure about the prison's ability to do so for them? So these are like future questions that I hope like future research or just surveying could really answer. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.